So welcome, of course, from the Jesus College Intellectual Forum and the University of Cambridge's Think Lab. My name is Sarah Steele, and I am the Deputy Director of the Intellectual Forum, and also a Senior Research Associate of Cambridge Public Health. Before we get into this morning's event, I'm just going to cover a few things about the Intellectual Forum, which was set up 4 years ago to get people thinking and to explore those issues that often fall between departments in a university. We've had so many stellar speakers, from fashion designer Jimmy Choo, to former New Zealand Prime Minister Helen Clark, to the director of NASA's Deep Space X-ray Observatory, Belinda Wilkes. We've also showed off the transformational work being done by many of our own academics at Jesus College and at the University of Cambridge. But one thing you might have noticed is that well-being, as well as building better futures, have been themes that have run through many of our events. And so it's extremely pleasing to have Professor Huppert with us today to take a more focused insight into these topics. Professor Huppert is a psychologist with a long-standing research interest in the science of well-being and the promotion of human flourishing. Her work brings together approaches from cognitive psychology to neuropsychology and also a population perspective derived from epidemiology. Felicia has advised governments and international bodies on the measurement of well-being and on policies to enhance well-being. She spends parts of the year in the UK, where she's the founding director of the Wellbeing Institute here at the University of Cambridge and an emeritus professor of psychology. Felicia's current positions include an honorary professorship at the University of Cambridge's Body, Heart and Mind in the Business Research Group, as well as a visiting position at the Department of Psychology at the University of New South Wales in Sydney. She's a member of the Australian Expert Group of the Global Mindfulness Initiative and director of the Australian Compassion Council Scholars Program. She's a fellow of the Black Dog Institute and a member of the Scientific Advisory Board of Prevention United, an Australian organisation committed to the promotion of mental health and the prevention of mental disorders. She's a fellow of the British Psychological Society and of Darwin College in Cambridge, and is the past chair of the European Network for Positive Psychology and a member of the board of directors for the International Positive Psychology Association. She's been on many technical advisory groups on a range of issues and on a range of wellbeing technical advisory group, for example, for the UK Office of National Statistics, as well as on the UN expert group on happiness and well-being. Importantly, she recently co-authored a wonderful book on creating the world we want to live in, which we will link to after the event and provide you also with information on how to buy the book and get a discount. But in short, we're delighted to have Professor Huppert with us today and to welcome any questions you have from her using that Q&A function, which we'll come to after a brief presentation. So thank you, and over to you, Professor Huppert.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for that introduction, and warm thanks to the IF for the invitation. It's particularly timely, of course, because we've been hearing so much about how we need to build back better and build back fairer because of all the global problems that have been happening in the world in the last few years. I mean, of course, the COVID pandemic and the Black Lives Matter movement, the Me Too movement, political polarization, and the terrible threats to the environment that we've been experiencing. So what I wanted to suggest is that positive psychology and the science of well-being have a valuable role to play in making the world better and fairer. And I'm just going to pause here because, I wasn't quite sure that it was as I wanted it. I was seeing just some black and white images on the screen, but I think all is well now.
All is indeed well. We can see you and hear you loud and clear. There's no technical difficulties there.
Okay, very good. So I think I need to begin by saying what well-being is. And in a nutshell, well-being is about feeling good and functioning well most of the time. And I think it's what we all want to do. And it's something that comes from our own skills and resources to some extent, but it also depends upon the external context. Being in communities and societies that enable us to feel good and function well, to develop our full potential and contribute as much as we would like to our community. And importantly, well-being is not about feeling good all the time. It's absolutely essential that we acknowledge the difficult experiences that we all have, the sadness, the disappointments, the frustrations. Well-being is about managing these difficult experiences, acknowledging them and managing them, as well as appreciating the positive ones. And one of the things we know from the research is that there are many benefits associated with a high level of well-being, which we sometimes call flourishing. And for example, people with high levels of well-being are better learners. They're more productive and more creative. They tend to have better relationships. They have better health and life expectancy. And also they contribute more to the community. So there's lots of reasons to think that well-being is a very good thing. And there's a great deal of knowledge now about how to increase well-being in individuals. For example, just one very, very simple practice that's come out of positive psychology is the idea that at the end of the day, you might practice gratitude. So just think of 3 good things that happened, things you're grateful for. And what the evidence shows is that it has a tremendous effect on our sense of well-being, on our mood, and also in reducing symptoms of depression. So I'm not going to say a great deal about positive psychology in relation to the individual, but just to raise the question about whether the principles and practices of positive psychology can be used to go beyond the individual to affect wider society. And this was the question that 7 of us posed at a positive psychology meeting a few years ago in France. We were rather alarmed at how all of the things that we've learned from positive psychology at this meeting were applied almost exclusively to individuals, whereas we felt very strongly that they had the power to change things, families, organizations, institutions, things across the world. And we decided to try and think about how this could be done. Now, we weren't the first people to try and look at the broader effects of positive psychology. But what I want to offer you today is a simple framework for thinking about this. And really, it's an ecosystemic framework where we begin with the individual, recognizing that the individual has effects on the people around them. So from the individual, we go to the interpersonal, the direct people that are affected, and then to broader rings here, to our organizations, our communities, our society, and out to the wider world. So individual flourishing has an influence, a ripple effect that goes right out into the wider world. But also there's an effect in the opposite direction. So when the outer layers are flourishing, when our planet is flourishing, and our society, our communities, our organizations are flourishing, that has a flow-on effect back into individuals. And so we think that the principles of positive psychology can be applied more broadly. And I'm going to sort of give some examples of this. Let's start with the very first one of the principles that we want to talk about. And it's in many ways the most important, I think. It's about the importance of feeling connected to others. It's something that I think we all noticed very much during the pandemic, the loss of connection with many people, and perhaps also an increased connection with neighbors or other people who were very helpful. And because we are a social species, this sense of being connected to others is profoundly important for our well-being. And in fact, when we experience social exclusion, what happens is that the centers in the brain that respond to physical pain are activated. So social exclusion is as painful as physical pain. And that's a pretty remarkable thing to recognize. Another problem that we're experiencing a lot in the world at the moment is loneliness. And that lack of connection can have really profound effects on our physical health. In fact, the effects can be as large as the effects of smoking or obesity on our physical health. We all, I think, experience loneliness at times, and we tend to think of older people as being more lonely. But what's very interesting is that the research shows that when you do studies of representative samples of people, and if you plot along the bottom axis, if you plot age along the bottom and loneliness going up the vertical axis, what you find is a shallow U-shaped function where the people who are the loneliest are young adults and older adults, which is really interesting. And a very large BBC analysis of hundreds of countries and regions around the world and very large numbers of people participating showed that the loneliest people were young men in individualist societies. And of course, in those societies, what's valued is self-interest and materialism, and that is associated with loneliness. And then we can also ask ourselves the question, what's the antidote to loneliness? And the antidote to loneliness is connection. So it turns out that when lonely people volunteer or get to do things for others, not only does the loneliness disappear, but their sense of connection returns and well-being returns. So another aspect of being connected to others is that we can be connected not just to other humans, but to all living things. And when we do feel connected to all living things, we're much more likely to want to preserve habitats and really look after biodiversity and value all the extraordinary life on our planet. So moving on to the second of the principles that we want to talk about, which is autonomy. It turns out to be very important for our well-being to have a sense that we have some choice over things in our life. And in fact, this is true both of individuals and of collectives, of organizations, even nations. The World Happiness Report that comes out every year looks at what is it that creates the greatest happiness in individuals and across nations. And they've looked at over 150 nations on a regular basis. Time and again, they find that one of the most important things is feeling that we have choice over life decisions. And interestingly, the other one that comes out along with this is the sense of social support. So social support and choice are the two that are most associated with happiness. So autonomy is also very important when we make sure that others have it. So supporting individuals and organizations to be more autonomous turns out to be a very good thing. When parents support their children to be more autonomous, the children have a sense of responsibility and they're more inventive. And the same is very much true in workplaces. A workplace that supports autonomy rather than micromanagers is a more flourishing and more innovative workplace. So let's move on. And the third of the principles that we want to talk about is a sense of competence. We all like to feel that we're effective in the things we do, effective and capable. And this is, and also that we have a sense of progress. And this is something that's actually becoming more challenging at the moment because life is changing very, very fast. And we often find ourselves in situations where we don't feel competent. And the real question is, how do we manage those situations? That's what determines our well-being. If we recognize that, okay, it's a new situation, it's going to take us a while to learn and adapt, that is a very helpful approach. And indeed, it's now increasingly recognized that we learn more from our setbacks and our failures than we do from our successes. And this has also been called a growth mindset. So it really is very important for our well-being to recognize that even at times where we're not competent, we can learn, we can adapt, and we can get better. So what's the fourth of our principles? It's paying attention or noticing the things that go well. Now, it's interesting that we have evolved to have a negativity bias, and we're much more likely to pay attention to things that go wrong, or people's inadequacies, our own inadequacies, the negative parts of the news, and so forth. And it's understandable, but it's actually not very helpful. It turns out that our well-being is much more improved if we look at strengths rather than weaknesses, strengths in others, strengths in ourselves as well. If we look at the positives, if we look at solution-focused thinking rather than just problem-based thinking. And there's a lovely example of this in an organization called constructive journalism. So much of journalism is very bleak. It tends to sensationalize things that go wrong. But in fact, constructive journalism, sure, it talks about the problems in the world, it talks about those, but at the same time, it always focuses on possible solutions. So we don't end up feeling so stressed and helpless. And the other thing is that being aware of positive emotions and positive attitudes is extraordinarily helpful. So in fact, when we have a higher range of positive emotions, it's very good for our physical health and indeed our life expectancy. And longitudinal studies show how that's linked, how positive emotions are linked to better health and life expectancy. And in fact, sorry, I'm just going to pause. I'm so sorry. As Sarah knows, I've got a really awful cold and I've been on medication and my mouth is very dry. So please forgive me. I'm going to take a sip of water. That feels better. Yes, so recognizing the positives in organizations, for example, as with appreciative inquiry, is also very helpful rather than always focusing on what's wrong with that organization and putting it right. Focusing on what the strengths are and building on those strengths has a very powerful effect. So finally, we want to talk about a sense of meaning. And our well-being is very much connected with having a sense of meaning. A sense that what we do is significant and worthwhile, and it has benefits beyond the self or beyond just our organization. And when we have a sense of meaning, it motivates us to continue working towards a cause. It energizes us. And in the case of individuals, they may have very, very stressful occupations that would ordinarily lead to burnout. But people who have a sense of meaning are much less likely to burn out. And of course, having an organizational or institutional sense of meaning can really instill and inspire others to make change. And one thing that I always think of is Fridays for Future. You know, that a schoolgirl, Greta Thunberg, has made such a profound difference to so many young people around the world, has inspired them to have a sense of meaning about the environment. And let's hope that all their good work continues to prosper and our environment really does change because young people care so much. So we can have that one off. And the next thing I want to talk about is, as another part of the framework, are 3 core capabilities. So we've talked about the 5 principles, but there are skills that underpin these principles. And these skills, although they reside in individuals, can have really profound effects well beyond the individual. Let me just name them. The first of them is open mind, the second is open heart, and the third is clear thinking. So what do we mean by open mind? Well, in order to see clearly, we need to be aware of what's going on around us and inside us. And in particular, we need to be aware of these experiences as we are experiencing them, to really notice what's happening. And this is called mindful awareness. And the reason it's very important is because so much of the time we're on autopilot. We're rushing through our lives, moving from one thing to the next, reacting often in very automatic ways and ways that may not be at all helpful. But when we are aware of our experience, we're able to pause. We're able to see clearly what's happening, and as a result, make better choices. So let's just take an example. You might be a bit angry with a workmate, and rather than giving them a tongue lashing, you may stop, notice what's going on in your body. Maybe there's some tension in the belly, maybe in the jaws, but pause, breathe and think, yes, I'm feeling angry, but what is the best way to respond here so as to maintain our relationship? And that pause is incredibly helpful. At the individual level, the evidence that mindfulness makes a difference is enormous. For example, it helps with many kinds of mental health problems, with depression, anxiety, eating disorders, and substance misuse. But it also helps with general well-being, being able to manage difficult experiences and really enjoy the positive ones. And what also I find quite remarkable is when we look at the neuroscience, it doesn't take long for the structures in the brain to change. It's just 8 weeks, which is a standard mindfulness course. At the end of that time, you can actually see structural changes in the brain that correspond exactly to what you would expect. So increases in attention and learning and memory, increases in emotion regulation, and in positive mood. And also, maybe surprisingly, increases in empathy and compassion. And that brings us then to not just the individual benefits, but the wider benefits of mindfulness. So the research shows that when you do one of these standard 8-week courses, even when it's entirely based on the individual, there are pro-social benefits. So people who've done a course are much more likely to come to the aid of a stranger. They're more likely to give donations to charity. And they're also more likely to become aware of their impact on the environment, the everyday choices they're making about food and transport and energy and waste, and choose things that are beneficial for the environment rather than harmful. And there's other ways in which mindfulness has effects that reach out beyond the individual. So for example, if we are mindful in our relationships, if we listen mindfully to someone, that's a great gift. And then if we speak mindfully, it benefits our interpersonal relationships. And partly because of this, mindful leadership has become of great interest in organizations. And there is evidence that when leaders are mindful, workplaces are much more likely to flourish. There's also a very interesting application of mindfulness in policy making. So making policy involves a series of complex decisions. And The Mindfulness Initiative, which began in the UK Parliament and is now being used across 45 different countries, helps politicians and policymakers to think through some of these decisions that they make. So, for example, it helps them to recognize their own motivations, beliefs, and biases, as well as the motivations, beliefs, and biases of others, perhaps in other political parties. And through recognizing all of these, to perhaps come together in a more consensual way when developing policies that are less ideologically motivated and better informed. So, yes, so I think having an open mind, not judging, but being more willing to listen and work with others is one of the profound effects that mindfulness can have beyond the individual. So turning now to open heart. Compassion and kindness open our hearts to the struggle and suffering that we see around us, and also motivate us to help. And sorry. They have very great benefits at the individual level. Self-compassion, for example, is profoundly good for our mental health and well-being. And we need it because so many of us are our own harshest critics. We give ourselves a very hard time. But when we're kind and compassionate towards ourselves, it definitely benefits our mental health and our well-being. But so too does what we do for others. And it turns out that what we do for others is better for our own well-being than what we do for ourselves. And there's that classic study where undergraduates were given a small amount of money and asked to, at random, and asked to spend it either on themselves or others. And their happiness was measured before and after. And it increased in both cases, but it increased much more in those who spent this amount of money on others. Now, one of the interesting things about that study is not just the finding itself, but the fact that when the students were debriefed and asked what did they think would lead to the greater happiness, both groups thought spending on themselves would lead to the greater happiness, and it doesn't. It's what we do for others that has the bigger impact on us. And it's also very interesting, once again, looking at the brain science, because when we're kind and compassionate towards others, the reward centers of our brain are activated. And this feeds into the long-standing debate about altruism. Is it truly altruistic only if we get nothing from it? Well, no, because we inevitably get something from it because our reward centers are being activated. And there's the sense that kindness and compassion are hardwired. We see them in young children. There's some beautiful studies looking at empathy and compassion in rats that have been done in Japan. But of course, it can go awry. Sadly, compassion and kindness can disappear. And there's one study that really breaks my heart in some ways when I see it, and it was done at Manchester University. There was an advertisement for people who were Manchester United football fans to come into a lab. And they came into a lab and they took a survey about why they love Manchester United and why they love coming to games and what they get out of it. And then they were told to go to another building to do another part of the study. And on the way to the other building, they passed someone who looked like they'd just sprained their ankle and were clearly in pain. And the question is, did they show compassion towards this person? The answer is absolutely, if they were wearing a Manchester United t-shirt. But if they were wearing a Liverpool t-shirt, no, nobody stopped and helped. Almost nobody stopped and helped. Or if they were wearing an unmarked t-shirt. So where was their compassion? There was another part to the study. Again, people were asked to come in if they supported Manchester United, but this time in the survey, they were asked to explain why they love football more generally, and they gave lots of answers to that. And again, the same situation. Someone looked like they were in pain. This time, almost as many people stopped to help someone in a Liverpool shirt as in a Manchester shirt, but still not the person in the unmarked shirt. So how can we reintroduce compassion when it seems to be lacking? And there's now great interest and effort in doing so in so many levels. With parenting, as introducing compassion in the home. In schools, there's a wonderful thing called the kindness curriculum that was developed in Michigan with preschool children, showing wonderful effects of this 12-week curriculum, not only on the way they treat each other, but also with other benefits in terms of cognitive function and self-regulation. It's being used widely now in workplaces, so compassionate work has become of great interest. Although I must say that one of the sad things is the studies in workplaces are not always as well controlled as in other settings. But one other example I wanted to give of compassion is in prisons. We certainly need to see more compassion towards prisoners, and Norway has been leading the world in this regard. They treat prisoners with dignity and give them human rights in the way they're in the way they live, in the way they've got access to education and training and mental health improvement and so forth. And they're also helped to rehabilitate into the society afterwards, help with work and housing. What effect has this had in Norway? Well, first of all, the crime rate has gone down all over Norway, and prisoners rarely reoffend. And the other thing that's remarkable is so many prisoners, when they went in, were unemployed. But even 5 years after they come out of prison, they're in work, not needing to use welfare. So I think many countries around the world can learn from this experience and show more compassion towards prisoners, because after all, crime is not just about individuals. There are social determinants of crime, and we should have the compassion to recognize that. And then the final one of the three core capabilities that I wanted to mention is clear thinking. We're bombarded with information these days, and it's so important to be able to evaluate it properly. And it's very difficult, of course, because there's a lot of disinformation out there, a lot of fake news. There are algorithms targeted towards us, trying to intensify our current beliefs. So how can we think clearly? How do we know what are trusted sources? None of us wants to be duped. So this is really a very important thing to consider. And one of the things that's very useful to do is to look at viewpoints that are different to our own. And there's a wonderful international study called My Country Talks. It's been mostly used across Europe, but in the US just recently, a couple of weeks ago, they were doing a similar survey. So what happens is tens of thousands of people are invited to do a survey, giving their opinions about current issues, issues around immigration, around climate change and things like that. Then people are paired up who are as different as possible in terms of their opinions. And in the good days before COVID, they literally met together and talked and recognized each other's humanity, recognized that that person is not just stupid who disagrees with me. There's reasons why they think the way they do. And friendships developed out of this and a deeper understanding. And I do think that's profoundly important. There's also a wonderful game that's been developed by colleagues at Cambridge University in the psychology department called the fake news game, which is for teenagers. And what happens is they're taught how to create fake news. And as a result of doing that, they're much better able to spot it out in the real world. So there are many ways that one can help people, train younger people and older people to think more clearly about information and not just assume that my way is the only right way. And of course, this is profoundly important too in reducing tribalism and the polarization that we've been seeing so much. So it is possible to teach these skills. And what I want to suggest is that when we put these three core capabilities together, keep going. The capabilities of an open mind, an open heart, and clear thinking. This produces wise action. And wise action is about understanding the complexity of a situation, but nevertheless choosing what is good in the long term for us and others. And this is illustrated here. Wise action across all different domains of life is about moving from me to we, and from short-term thinking to longer-term thinking, where we start to consider what's good for all of us in the long term and for future generations. And I just love that in Wales, they have a minister for future generations, so that every policy is judged in terms of its benefit for the future. So just concluding, we try to apply these principles and capabilities across many different areas of life. And in the book that I've co-authored with other wonderful colleagues, all of this information is presented across these different domains. And not only is science presented and the stories of what works, but also ideas for action at every level, ideas for governments, for communities, for schools, workplaces, and individuals. And there are many, many stories, many different studies that are reported here. And here you can see the website. So if any of you is interested in getting additional references, do please visit our website. So thank you, and over to Sarah and Q&A.
So we have lots of questions that have come in, and they are absolutely wonderful. I'm sure you'll be incredibly happy, Professor Huppert. We hopefully will get through them all, but we may not. And just to those in attendance, I may collapse a few of these questions together because a few are a little bit similar or extend each other. So just if I don't ask your question verbatim, please forgive me if I take a little bit of host liberties with the wording. But the first one that we've got here that I think really follows on from what you were just saying is, what do you think can be learned from positive psychology and some of the principles you've set out for addressing particularly the climate crisis?
Yes, look, I think there's many things, but where I would start is to say, it's been suggested that one reason we've been so slow in doing something about it is because a lot of the information was based on fear. And the assumption was that if we were scared enough, we would start to do something about it. Or if we were ashamed of our actions, we would start to do something about it. But what positive psychology shows us is that although negative actions or negative emotions like fear and anger and shame, well, particularly fear and anger, I think, can initiate actions, they're not very useful when it comes to finding solutions. And the reason is that they narrow our focus, they narrow our perception, they narrow our thinking. And so it does not help us in finding constructive solutions. And in fact, what happens is that when we are motivated by positive emotions, that is much more effective. If we're motivated by, for instance, love and pride, we're much more likely to make change in relation to environmental matters or indeed others. And yeah, it's one of the things that I think a lot of environmental organizations are recognizing now. We need more positive messages, and we also need to celebrate small wins, no matter how small. Particularly, if there's something that's been done by a community to improve an area of environment, to really feel proud of that And that then motivates us to go on and do other things. So I think the positive emotions is a very important part of what we can learn there. And then, of course, the connection too. There's a great deal that we can do as individuals, but it is so much more powerful when we work together, when we feel connected, and when we feel a sense of meaning from what we're doing together, particularly on something as important and as urgent as climate justice.
So we've got a few questions that kind of follow on from that at a more world leadership and political leaders level. So we've got a few questions here. Somebody's asked about like the pandemic and environmental damage like the climate crisis. I am stumbling my words today. I have really bad hay fever to go along with your cold. So I totally feel you on the need for a drink. But yes, the questions we've got are, how can we move beyond the current politics, which is really focused on short-termism? Some other people have noticed about the polarity, the kind of two-party systems in many countries. I realize we've got people from all around the world. We've also got some people here who've said about international politics and business leaders. One suggestion was, do you think they should all be sent on mindfulness courses? How do we move beyond these kind of short-termisms and get people taking some of your principles on board at that leadership level? What thoughts do you have on those?
Well, as I suggested, I mean, the mindfulness initiative is certainly trying to make inroads into working with politicians and policymakers to help them make these very complex choices and to make them in less polarized ways wherever possible. Certainly, I think the mindfulness is a part of that, but compassion too. When we treat people with compassion, we do recognize our common humanity, and we're much more likely, I think, to try to find shared solutions to problems. And my goodness, we certainly need to be finding shared solutions to many of these big problems.
So one of the questions here is, what would be your top 3 tips for world leaders to do in the post-pandemic period to embed your ideas?
Yes. So in addition to these, the core capabilities that I spoke about, really prioritizing what matters to people and the planet, not what is the bottom line, not what just improves the GDP or special interest groups, but really looking at what's best for people. And again, I guess it's some of the countries that are now using wellbeing budgets do look at policies that particularly focus on the least advantaged in society. So whatever policies we have, let's make sure that they do 2 things. One is they benefit the least advantaged, and 2 is they always think about benefit to future generations.
And on that note, we have a question about what would you best advise teachers and parents to do to use these skills with youth? And a really, really important question that dovetails with that, which is, Grandma Felicia, will you come and talk to us from Felix and Juliet at our school, because kids are the future? So I believe that your grandchildren are here and would like to couple onto a question that I'm getting here from teachers about parents and teachers using these skills around youth.
Look, what it really comes down to most importantly is listening. Really listening to kids, listening to the students of all sorts, and giving them autonomy, giving them the possibility of making their own choices. The listening thing is so beautifully exemplified in a study in Glasgow, where there was an incredibly high rate of students being excluded from schools. and also a high rate of youth crime. And the schools changed. They decided that they needed to be different. They needed to really take an interest in children as individuals, as people, you know, who are worthy, who have their own skills and talents, need to be listened to, need to be respected. And so discussion was invited, and there were very vibrant discussions that happened between students and teachers. And everything changed in those schools. The crime rate went down, the youth crime rate in Glasgow went down. And for a period of some years, there were no students excluded from school. And twice as many students sat for their hires. So this was about adults listening to kids. And that is profoundly important. And in fact, it's the other thing that I would wish is that whatever policies are created, that there are always young people as part of the process who co-create these policies with the experts, because I think we'll then end up with much better policies, whether they're in schools, workplaces, whether they're environmental policies or policies around all kinds of discrimination and so on. We certainly need to work not only with the people directly affected, but with the young people coming up through the system. And it can't be just token. It's not just, oh yes, we have consulted. That's not good enough. They have to be there as equal players in decision-making roles to co-create good policies and good environments.
So one of the questions there is about, as well, is about the increasing rise in self-harming teenagers. There was a question here about, do you have any views on why that's happening and how we might attend to it?
Oh, I think the pressure on teenagers is phenomenal. The extremely high expectation from a lot of parents, a lot of schools, and from the social media. You know, the teenagers are heartbroken if they don't get enough likes when they put out a post. So life is very, very tough. We certainly need much more self-compassion among teenagers, recognizing they're great. They have so many, you know, innate capabilities and talents, and it doesn't matter what other people say. They themselves need to have a better sense of what works for them. And in general, as well as needing a great deal more help with mental health problems such as self-harm, we need to introduce from a very early age health promotion approaches that teach people the skills and resources so they can manage difficulties better. Because we're all going to encounter difficulties in our lives. And the sooner we learn about them, the better. From, you know, pre-primary through every level of schooling. You know, what is education for? It's no longer just education for work. It's education for life. And we do need to introduce these ideas, social emotional learning, mindfulness and so on, from an early age, so that children, and when they become adults, everyone is better resourced to deal with the very real problems that we're all going to confront.
So we had some questions that kind of lead off from that, one of which, and let me read this one to you, the Think Lab, which are actually co-hosting with us, had some people on before about digital well-being, which is something you just raised about social media and teenagers. It's certainly something that the Think Lab manager, Tyler Shores, has worked on extensively. We'd like to know what would be your top 5 tips for making better choices for having a better relationship with this kind of media for well-being. And alongside that, there was another question about from another attendee about, you mentioned about social media, but it thrives a lot on contention and algorithms that often bring to the top the very worst and most controversial things, or commercialism and these sorts of things that you've mentioned don't have a great impact on well-being. How can leaders and tech companies act on your points? So there's kind of the 2 factors there. For us using these, what are your top 5 tips for well-being? And also for those who have a capacity to influence the actual media itself, what could they do?
Well, I'm not sure about, you know, my top 5 tips, but my top 1 is that media, the social media in particular, are designed to grab our attention and hold on to it, using techniques that are very addictive. And in order to take back our attention, in order to regain our control, it's very, very important to become aware of our experiences, not just be reactive, but actually recognize, okay, here I am, spending yet another 3 hours on whatever is the medium. Is that what I really want to do? Is that the best thing for my well-being? Maybe not. I'm not going to just keep reacting. I'm actually going to make choices here. So I think that one is really profoundly significant, that idea that we can take back control. In terms of what the companies should do, it's not something I've thought about in great detail. But I suppose working with young people would be a very good start. So that young people can, assuming the companies have some benevolent intentions, and I think some of them do, working with young people about how to make these things more beneficial and less harmful would be a good start.
And so there's a lot of questions that are coming up about different people who are experiencing poor well-being or experiencing particular difficulties. So one thing, there's been a couple of questions here. Somebody who said they work in the NHS and a lot of people are exhausted and near burnout. Mindfulness training is available, but requires commitment across time that's entirely unrealistic for those who are currently working in their circumstances. Are there any shortcuts or quick wins that could be taken? And there's similar questions here about people who are experiencing difficulties, needing to kind of draw on different things like food banks in very deprived situations currently. How can we draw those senses of autonomy and also foster some of these more well-being, positive psychology focused principles with those groups? So I'm drawing together a number of questions here, but for those in circumstances that are less than ideal, let's say those who are experiencing burnout or real challenges right now, how can we actually foster these principles?
Look, in one way, you can't really take shortcuts, because these skills and resources are so important that they really do need to be practiced. On the other hand, there are short snippets available to just help people through a crisis situation. And I know over here, for instance, in some of our major hospitals, doctors, nurses, healthcare workers were being offered just 15 minutes a day of a sort of mindfulness and compassion course. And they did find that very helpful. But of course, as soon as possible, they would be well advised to do something more serious and actually practice. Because in the end, it's the practice that helps. I mean, mindfulness trains the mind in the same way that exercise trains the body. And you do need to practice it, or it has very little benefit.
So could you think of some things that could help people who are physically ill? Somebody has asked here, is there anything that can be done if you are in that physical illness stage, which a lot of people have been?
It's always possible, even when physically ill, I believe, to think about whether there's something that one is grateful for. And that gratitude relaxes you, makes you feel more positive, and could actually, in theory, have spin-off effects onto physical illness itself. But the other thing I wanted to say, is only sort of slightly related to that, is that very often there are, let's say, elderly people who may be physically ill, may be living in care homes and the like, and all sorts of good people come in and help in various ways. But what we underestimate is the ability of these people themselves to give help to others. and the immense benefit that that would produce. You may know of some lovely programs where older people in care homes mix with children and tell stories and read to them and so on. And the benefits are just tremendous. And it's a win-win situation for the older person and for the kids. And I didn't actually send greetings to a couple of grandchildren called Felix and Juliet, who are the most extraordinary kids, very, very autonomous and kind and capable and responsible and loving, and just the way you'd love kids to be. So even with chronic pain, I know that one of the recommendations is, let's imagine you have terrible, terrible pain in one shoulder, and all of your energy and effort is going into dealing with that pain, even breathing through it and so on. But sometimes you think, wait a minute, actually the other shoulder is quite comfortable. And being able to make that shift and recognizing that you are not pain, there is pain in your body, but it's in part of your body, and there are some other parts that are okay. So there are many ways in which some of these difficulties can be alleviated, at least in part, or for a short time.
A different question, taking a different kind of pathway here, having looked at that, is about some of the things you mentioned about altruism and empathy. So someone here has asked, how do altruism and empathy evolve, do you think? Why is it not evident in all cases throughout nature? And following on from that, a different attendee's kind of got a different question that couples on about the psychological benefits you mentioned of spending on others versus yourself. How can you use that in your daily life to kind of figure out what goes to charity or generosity as opposed to things for you?
So a question about why don't we see empathy and altruism in all species?
Yeah, so they've kind of said, how did altruism and empathy evolve, do you think? And why is it not evident in all cases throughout nature?
It's clear why they would have evolved in social species. Because in social species, we are so dependent upon each other, or in evolutionary terms, we were so dependent upon each other for our survival, that it was very important for people to help each other and to understand how other people felt. And the mirror neurons in the brain play a very important role here in empathy. And I think they have evolved quite widely in other social species as well. Enabling one animal to understand how things are for the other animal, and as a result, maybe come to their assistance. But I'm not an ethologist, and I just can't talk about whether all social species have evolved empathy and altruism, if altruism indeed exists. I would rather think of it as helping behavior that actually helps both the person who's being helped and the person who's helping through these reward mechanisms in the brain. And the second question, you may need to remind me, Sarah.
It's just about practicing that altruism. How do we actually do it? How should we balance that other versus us, was the kind of question they were alluding to.
Yeah, because we clearly do need to do things for ourselves. And we talked about the importance of being kind and compassionate towards ourselves if we're struggling or suffering. But we also, it's also absolutely legitimate to give ourselves treats, to do nice things for ourselves. I don't think there's any simple answer. It's going to be, first of all, the recognition that what we do for others, whether it's directly helping, whether it's through generosity or just smiling, at strangers on the street, what we do for others makes a difference not only to them but to us as well. Giving generously to good causes is a wonderful thing. and makes us feel good. I don't know if there was an assumption that there would be a right answer, that we should give 10% of our income or some other. That's entirely a subjective matter.
And so somebody's followed on saying, as our world increasingly urbanizes, how can we use positive psychology to argue for the fairer distribution of economic resources, especially in the context of developing nations and the global south? Somebody just wondered
especially in the context of
developing nations and the global south, to use their language. Do you have any ideas about how we could deploy it to argue for fairer distribution?
I think the argument for fairer distribution is just that it's fairer. The details of how exactly you go about it, that's a pretty complex story. But why is it specifically around urbanization? I guess I didn't quite understand that.
I'm relaying a question. If somebody wants to throw back in one and particularly asked about that, that would be great. There's a lot of questions and we're very shortly going to need to wrap up, so we may not make it to all of them. But if the person that asked that question is still here and wants to throw it into the below, I'll come back to that in a second. We've got a couple of questions though, just in the meantime, while we're waiting, just to ask about particular practices. So we've got somebody here asking particularly about how you might apply this to their executive coaching practice, and somebody else who's asking here about the university context. They've said, I'm just relaying this, do you think current practices, particularly focusing on short-term metrics like grants and publications, are undermining the sense of meaning in academia, and that's in turn contributing to burnout? How do you think we could practice these initiatives to focus more on people finding meaning in their work? So there's kind of two questions there, one about the academic specific environment, but also one about how we might apply this to practice things like executive coaching.
I think the first one is probably easier. It seems to me that already a lot of what executive coaches do would be very congruent with those 5 principles and the core capabilities. I think there would be a very good fit there. And obviously, if that person would like to know more about it, please read the book, and especially the resources that are on the webpage, because not only are there more detailed, complete references on the webpage, there's also some marvelous resources in the form of videos and podcasts, webinars and so forth, as well as books and so on that one could read. So I think that would be a good place to look. With regard to, what was the second one?
So there was just a little bit of questions about, and I need to go back, sorry. I have forgotten as well. I have to apologize. About academia. So about
yes, no, I have enormous sympathy for that. I think that the pressure that universities are under at the moment, to publish, and the salami slicing that has to happen because there've got to be so many, and they've got to be in the top tier journals, and they've got to be so many grants and so forth and so on, and it's incredibly competitive. And people really, and enormous teaching loads now, typically as well. And so people are not able to do the serious thinking, the serious reflection, the interdisciplinary discussions that genuinely lead to deeper thought and to new discoveries. So I have enormous sympathy there. I don't know quite how you go about making that change, but I'm absolutely in agreement that some sort of change is desperately needed.
Yes, and people have actually mentioned this about the genuine redistribution of power throughout large organizations. Somebody here has asked, like, with top leaders, how do we go about rechanging those kind of relationships that you suggested about including young people, redistributing power and those sorts of things, when actually it's most likely that they got into that position because power is something they themselves value. So some questions here about how we do this in large organizations, and also some people asking about how we do this in public spaces. How do we achieve these sorts of things?
Look, I wish I knew the answer. It could be if there was some kind of, I don't know, legislation that suggested there always had to be representative bodies. I mean, I do think those ideas that all policies need to consider the disadvantaged, all policies need to consider future generations, all, I guess, all bodies, all decision-making bodies need to have adequate representation of the people about whom the decisions are being made. And as I say, not just we have consulted them, but genuine representation from these groups, be they Indigenous, be they women, be they whatever, but genuine representation. I think this would make a real difference to their effectiveness.
And somebody here has proposed being educated about emotional intelligence.
Yeah, very, very, very much so. And that's part of what I mentioned, social emotional learning. It's very much a part of mindfulness, which is very big on how we regulate our emotions. Yeah, absolutely. We should all learn about social intelligence.
So somebody here has just followed up with do you think that there is a means of incorporating mindful principles into the legal system as a mechanism of empowering people to significant decisions about the conduct of their lives?
Oh, I like that question. I think that's a great idea.
Thank you, David Hunter, who asked.
Yeah, no, I think that's a lovely idea. So that even within the legal profession, through noticing their own experiences, their own thoughts and values, their own motivations, they may come to understand that there is a different way. That as well as simply administering the letter of the law, there is so much more that could be done within the legal system if it prioritized the well-being of clients and of people.
And there's another slightly different question here, which is about the place of religious faith in a helpful, in terms of building resilience and changing societal and behavioural attitudes. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, there's been quite a lot of work done on that. And certainly religion can be very helpful in terms of increasing well-being, and religions have often recognized the importance of compassion, the importance of giving, and so forth. But what's very interesting is that in countries like the US, if you look at those big national surveys, there's a very strong relationship between having religious beliefs and well-being. But across Europe, which is a much more secular society, you don't see those same relationships. So well-being isn't necessarily associated with organized religion, but it is associated with all kinds of other values. The values around kindness and compassion and giving and freedom to make life choices and so forth. So there are some relationships, without a doubt, between religion and well-being, but it's not universal.
So there has been some other questions here that are more specific to psychology and to your expertise more widely. So there's a couple of questions here about treatment of mental illnesses. Is this likely to be productive, or does it just increase problems in isolation? And there's some further questions here about resources or suggestions that you have for people currently living with chronic illness, minimal support, maybe psychological difficulties connected to the fact that there's families at a distance, and that at the moment we're having pretty minimal face-to-face contact in some countries. I realize Australia's been a little bit different, but for those of us in the UK, we've had reduced contact with our families. We've had less socialized kind of experiences. And we're also seeing society more widely organized in a very individualistic way. The questions that have come here are, how do we build communities that have more regular face-to-face contact with each other in the future? How do we build so that people can kind of have this resilience in their basis, and how do we kind of respond to mental illness in the best ways possible. Some people have asked about CBT and DBT in the questions here. I'm not going to focus too much on those nutted down questions for psychologists, but more those broad principles you talk about in the book, and also some thoughts here on how we do this in the post-pandemic period.
Yeah, so mental illness is a very serious problem, and a growing problem across many societies, and certainly it did seem to increase during the pandemic, and would have been associated with loneliness, with isolation, with perhaps loss of identity, as well as, of course, loss of income and so on, and a lot of other pressures that people experienced. And one of the things that is absolutely clear is that nowhere in the world, according to the Sustainable Development Goals, nowhere in the world has an adequate system for dealing with mental health problems. It's always woefully underfunded, woefully understaffed. And there's no doubt that we do need much better funding, much better policies, much more access to mental health services. One beautiful way that this has been achieved is in Zimbabwe, where there were something like only one psychiatrist or psychologist per 5 million people. And my goodness, that is woeful lack of access, understaffing and underfunding. But what was done was that grandmothers were trained using the very best evidence-based talking therapies to sit on what was called friendship benches in parks. And people could come and talk to the grandmothers. And they had tremendous benefits in terms of reducing depression, particularly through these talking therapies. But there's no doubt that mental health services need to be improved the world over. But what's very interesting is that even if mental health services were really excellent, it wouldn't prevent mental health problems. So in Australia, for instance, there has been quite substantially increased funding over the last 20 years for mental health services, but the number of or proportion of people with mental health problems has not reduced at all during that period. And the reason is that the common mental health problems, the depression and anxiety, they arise in the general population. So even if you're treating one lot of people, there are plenty more, filling that gap and moving from maybe not very good mental health into actually a mental health problem. And so the crucial thing here is to work on early intervention, and particularly the promotion of mental health across the population, teaching the skills and resources that will allow people to deal with the challenges rather than falling into a serious mental health disorder.
We've had a lot of comments and questions and suggestions. Of course, we've run out of time, but one thing that did come up that I just want to kind of parrot back to you is that somebody said, I hope you don't mind me giving an opinion. I think paying someone a compliment every day makes them feel better. Having said that, really wanted to give you a compliment, which was, that's been a great presentation, Professor Huppert. It's been so interesting. So many people have put comments and said, a great session indeed, many thanks. Thank you for all your wisdom. From one of your fellow authors, in fact, there's been a comment as well. Lots of people have sent their thanks and actually asked lots of questions about context-specific applications. As you've mentioned, there's a huge number of resources. You've posted the web link on one of your slides here. We will also make sure that goes in our post-event follow-up. We'll include the link in the recording of this, as well as in our email that asks you to fill in the survey. We also have some comments in the chat box that have gone out for those of you who want to take a second before we close the webinar to grab those. They're there. But most of all, we wanted to extend our thanks to you.
Oh, thank you so much, Sarah. And if I can sort of just finish and say, look, change is never easy, but change is necessary. And I really do believe that with wisdom, hope, and with realistic hope, I really do think that we can make change happen, and we can create a fairer, more flourishing and more sustainable world. And every small step that we take makes a difference. But when we work together, that difference is magnified. So it's over to all of us, every one of us, to make whatever difference we can and join with others to magnify the effects and really try to make our world better and fairer and more sustainable.
Of course. Thank you so much for your time today, Professor Huppert. We will follow up with everybody who's joined us. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, Sarah.